Hi, I'm Kelly Truesdell, an Associate Director for Substance Use and Recovery Services at the University of Virginia, and we're going to be taking a look at the step of the strategic prevention framework that's implementation. Implementation is that critical process that brings together the puzzle pieces of the SPIF and allows us to determine, did we actually have the capacity, the partners, and the strategic planning processes in place that we thought we needed for a successful intervention? As institutions ask themselves, what can I be doing right now? There are three critical components to keep in mind. First, how are we establishing implementation supports? Next, how are we going to balance intervention, fidelity, and adaptation? And lastly, how are we going to ensure that interventions are accessible for our audiences? As we jump into that first step of establishing implementation support, we want to be mindful of the timing of the event to ensure that it aligns with the intervention purpose. So if we're planning a substance-free event at our institution, can it fall on the same day as a higher risk substance use day within our community and serve as an alternative for students that are choosing not to consume on that day? On the other hand, if we're planning an intervention and it falls on the day of a similar event, or the university president is hosting a welcome event, are we now competing with that institutional initiative? So we always want to have that bigger picture in mind and ensure that our timing of our event is intentional and collaborative for the purpose that we are trying to reach. We also want to be mindful of any historical context that may exist within our work. So are we working with an audience that's really familiar with our messaging? Have they gone through foundational training and this is an opportunity to scaffold in some higher level content? Are they champions of our work? Are they an audience that maybe has even been resistant to some of our past messaging? And we need to take a different implementation strategy to be successful. This really allows us to take a step back and determine who needs to have a seat at the table. Do we need to have somebody else facilitate the program? Is this an opportunity for us to bring in some peers and fellow students to help plan or potentially even deliver this message? How are we going to ensure that if we are bringing in outside facilitators, that they have adequate training to be relatable and credible and set up for success in this process? Maybe it is taking a step back and having some proactive conversations. So if we're going to be working with student athletes, do we need to have proactive conversations with coaches and athletic staff so that they understand the message that student athletes will hear and help reinforce it in their own conversations? So really being intentional around what is those implementation strategy, what supports are we going to need, and making sure that that process is set up for success. Next, when we look at balancing program fidelity and adaptation, we know that there are critical components that make up an evidence-based program to produce those consistent expected outcomes. And so anytime a university is navigating unique requests, working with a unique student population, or navigating limited resources, there can be the chance where they're going to have to adapt some type of evidence-based program. And it's really important that we're working with some of our national organizations, the existing research, to determine what are those key components that really should remain as is to help produce those needed outcomes. And then really figuring out what else might we be able to add in or supplement to that messaging. Also, going back to having multiple facilitators, if that's the case, you want to be making sure that you have some way to measure facilitator fidelity and making sure that each person is delivering the message in an effective way. So it can be really important to have those ongoing evaluation components built in to ensure that as you're making changes, we're evaluating and assessing, does that fidelity still exist? And then lastly, we want to assure that our interventions are accessible. So this might mean working with an accessibility office so that if you have visually impaired or hearing impaired members of your audience, that your content is inclusive and accessible for them. Or if you're working with a unique population like international students, can you work with a global engagement or international student life office or international students to really understand, how do I need to adjust this messaging? Maybe I need to use different examples that are culturally relevant for my audience. Maybe I need to change the literacy level of some of the words that I'm incorporating into my program or intervention. So really making sure that we're being mindful of who is those audience, how can we make sure that the message is accessible for them. And I want to end on the fact that implementation is the fun part. We really get to bring our work to fruition. And I don't want to miss the fact that it can be an opportunity to celebrate the success of our work, as well as celebrating the success of our institutional partners. It can be an opportunity to build that additional capacity as we recognize, hey, we see your efforts, what we're doing is working. Look at these wonderful examples of how we're making a difference for our university community. So don't forget that important step of celebrating the work that we do as you have an opportunity to implement these initiatives.